Before we start on preliminary sketches, it's useful to stop and think about composition, storytelling, and flow. As an art student and beginner painter, I was terrified of this thing called composition. It sounded important, but I didn't really know what it meant. And basically, all it is that you can control how your viewer's eye moves around your painting. There are some rules about composition that you can learn. For example, the rule of thirds, which is more useful to photography than pattern making. And there's the golden section ratio, which is more useful for graphic design than pattern making. I think you can have a lot of fun playing with composition for pattern making. I'll show you what I mean. For example, in this painting, a natural starting point is here with this toucan. The eye then naturally goes down to the green bird who is looking back at the toucan. Then there's a kind of S-curve going down the pattern from animal to animal. Then there are a few motifs placed to help the eye make its way back up towards the starting point again. Because this pattern is a half-drop repeat, the composition also naturally falls into diagonals. When presented with a lot of visual information, the brain naturally looks for shapes. So here, the darker blue leaves of this flower also create a diamond shape when the pattern is seen as a whole. And the same thing happens with this larger toucan and the larger yellow flower here. When I was painting this and working out the next thing to add, I thought I would put a chameleon over here, climbing up the branch. However, I then realized that the position I had painted it in was basically forming a horizontal line of motifs in my painting, which didn't look great. If I pushed that block of paper up a bit, I now have a diagonal forming, which is much better for the eye, and it completes the diamond shape. In the final pattern, this chameleon got edited out, but this example shows how, if you use watercolor blocks flexibly like this, you can work things out as you go along and make corrections, both to the things that you painted badly, as well as to your composition. Thinking about composition can get overwhelming, especially when you're at the beginning stages of your painting and you don't even know what you're going to paint. So don't worry about it too much. It's just useful to have these ideas in the back of your mind when you start working on your sketches. Another aspect of composition is storytelling. You can have a lot of fun creating little scenes or vignettes between your characters and motifs. I like to imagine my birds chatting to each other, sharing a joke or a little secret, so my patterns become playful and whimsical. One way to do this is to make sure that your characters are looking at each other rather than at the viewer. This is sometimes tricky, but it makes a big difference to the storytelling aspect of your work. Or you can paint animals watching other animals. You can play with groupings of characters. Like here, I've got two birds marveling at this butterfly. You can create subtle nuance and whimsy just by being playful. Here's an example of a frog who I like to think is practicing yoga. Linked with storytelling is flow. This almost happens without you having to think about it once you've got your storytelling going. But here's an example of how I created flow without having my characters looking at each other. These two birds are looking upwards towards the toucan, and this naturally draws the viewer's eye upwards as well. So to recap, the things to keep in mind when you start sketching are composition, which is how you want your viewer's eye to move around the painting, storytelling, which is the interactions between your characters, and flow, which is creating directional movement in your work. In the next video, we'll talk briefly about scale, and then we'll move on to sketching. See you there.